Thank you all again for coming. I'm very excited about what we're going to see today, and I want to thank Bob Moore for coming here, and I'd like to read a little bit of his bio if I could. Bob is a public historian with a background in art and film. He holds a Bachelor of Science Arts degree from Syracuse University and a master's and PhD degrees in history from Washington University here in St. Louis. He's been a historian for the National Park Service at Jefferson National Expansion Memorial in St. Louis since 1991. I told him that's certainly a nice assignment to be assigned to the old courthouse and the Gateway Arch. He has written articles for national magazines on Lewis and Clark's westward expansion and also on Dred Scott, and he is the author of 7 books. I told him I'd write books, but I didn't have any time. I was busy working. He currently is working on a book about the history and the construction of the Gateway Arch, which will be published this year, 2005. The book will incorporate oral history interviews with essays written especially for the publication by most of the major players in the Arch story. He was born and raised in upstate New York. Bob has been employed by the National Park Service for over 20 years, working in such diverse areas as Saratoga, Yorktown, Morristown, Gettysburg, and Sagamore Hill. Bob Moore's scholarly interests include the history of America's westward expansion movement, art, and motion picture history, American Indians, the African American heritage of St. Louis, the American Revolution, conservation, the progressive era, and presidential history. Whew. He currently teaches as an adjunct professor at Washington University's University College, and may be here next year. Please welcome Bob Moore.
Thanks very much for that nice welcome and for inviting me down here today. What I'd like to do is, in a very short period of time, really, for the amount of information that we'll try to give you, tell you about the story of the Gateway Arch, just what it is, how it was built, and how the whole thing came about. Because the story is a lot older story than most people think. Most people remember the arch being built in the 1960s and just kind of think of it maybe starting just a little bit before that, when actually the story goes all the way back to 1933. And we'll see how this slide thing works, if it works. Okay. Works like that. At any rate, the arch itself, as all of you know, has become a symbol of the city of St. Louis. When people see the arch flash on the screen on television during a sporting event or something, they know where that sporting event's taking place, because this has become an icon for our city and for the Midwest region, really, as a whole. The idea of the arch got started, as I said, back in 1933. And it was this man who started it, whose picture's on the screen behind me. This is a man named Luther Ely Smith. And some of you who visited the arch may know that there's a little park that separates the old courthouse from the arch, and it's named Smith Square for Luther Ely Smith. He was a lawyer in St. Louis and kind of a self-proclaimed do-gooder who wanted to take the run-down, dilapidated riverfront district of the city and turn it into something that St. Louisans could be proud of, not only in terms of the cosmetic appearance of it, but also in terms of what the first impression of the city would be to people coming in. It was also during the time of the Great Depression, so obviously this would be a project that could put people back to work, to build something on the riverfront that would be commemorative of St. Louis's history. And what his idea was to build a memorial to not only St. Louis in the 19th century, but St. Louis's role as the gateway to the West. The St. Louis's role in the huge migration of people from the east to the west during the 19th century, and most of them who came from east of here funneled through St. Louis to buy their supplies for their covered wagons to go into the west. And of course, this was the place where trappers and traders outfitted, where Lewis and Clark and Zebulon Pike and the other great explorers like Fremont and Long and others started their explorations of the West. This was a place where Indian treaties were concluded, and of course, it was a great transportation center using the rivers. The port of St. Louis was the second busiest in the country in the 19th century, busier than ports on either coast of the United States. Smith also wanted to make a park that was dedicated to our third president, Thomas Jefferson, because he said, and he is right in terms of history, that it was Jefferson's ideals and Jefferson's dream of moving into the West, which really fueled this idea of westward expansion from the beginning. Jefferson sending Lewis and Clark into the West, Jefferson's policies in terms of American Indians, good or bad, looking at them from the perspective of where we are today and the way we look at history today. And this is a picture of Smith again, but for the most part, it was an idea of a kind of a triumphal history, a celebration of American history that could take place on the St. Louis riverfront. And Smith took his idea to the then mayor of St. Louis, whose picture you see here, Bernard Dickman. Smith was a Republican, Dickman was a Democrat. There was no partisanship really in this whole idea. Both parties were well behind it here in St. Louis, but not necessarily in Washington. At the beginning, it was supposed to be a local idea, but Smith really wanted to push it to the national level. And through some political arm twisting, especially by Dickman, who was really a political boss in the eastern part of the state of Missouri at that time, they were able to convince President Franklin Roosevelt to sign an executive order creating Jefferson National Expansion Memorial, and that's our official title even today. The order was signed at the end of 1935. So that brought the National Park Service to St. Louis, and there have been park people, dressed similarly to myself, in St. Louis since 1936, administering Jefferson National Expansion Memorial. In the beginning, we had no buildings. There was a huge fight over the land on the riverfront because most of the owners of the land didn't want to just surrender it, give it up. It was the first park that I can think of in the entire United States that was created from privately held land. It started out as privately held land. The other parks, the great national parks in the West, like Yellowstone and Yosemite and Grand Canyon, were all federal lands. They were part of the federal land system that were declared kind of off limits and became national park areas. Well, this was the first one in the country where they kind of went in to private land, and this happens very rarely. This is just never even done today. You remember the outcry just in recent years about President Clinton declaring Escalante, which was federal land, but the people in the states, especially in Utah, were outraged by this huge chunk of land being taken out of the regular public domain and put into this protected status. At any rate, the city of St. Louis was a partner with the federal government in all of this, and what they did is they took the land by condemnation. The federal government wasn't too happy about this because it was setting precedents all along, but it was the city of St. Louis that pushed lawsuits against owners who were reluctant to sell out on their property, and there were private citizens who sued the city to try to keep their property. Well, the city won all the lawsuits. So by 1939, the boundaries of what would become the grounds of the Arch had been established, and in this aerial photo of what the riverfront looked like at that time, you can see a white dotted line that starts near the Eads Bridge down at the bottom part of the picture. And that whole area that I traced out with my finger is the boundaries of the park. So it goes to Poplar Street, which the famous bridge wasn't there yet, and down to the Eads Bridge on the north, which is at the bottom of this picture. And the little kind of nose out there on the right-hand side that goes to the west is the area around the old courthouse, which actually the National Park Service didn't have at the beginning. The city deeded the courthouse to the Park Service in 1940. Some of the WPA workers were involved in the project, especially with a little building on the riverfront that they wanted to preserve called the Old Rock House, which was the oldest standing building in St. Louis at that time. This in the picture to follow are some rare color photographs taken in the 1930s of the demolition of the buildings. There were 40 square blocks of the riverfront district that were completely leveled during this demolition, all save for the old cathedral, which was an 1834 building and stood on the spot where the French had established the Catholic Church back in 1774. And there had been a church standing there ever since 1774, and of course the cathedral still stands there today. And the old courthouse, which I mentioned was deeded to the Park Service. You can see it here in its mantle of coal-blackened soot, as it was when the Park Service received it. And of course the courthouse, it was the scene of the Dred Scott case back in the 1840s and 50s, where it started, and of course it ended with the Supreme Court decision in Washington, D.C. This is a picture of one of the courtrooms in the building, which people can still see today. I find that many locals even have gone to see the arch, but they've never actually gone a couple blocks to the west to see the old courthouse. So if you ever get a chance, I think you'd enjoy taking a look at that. This is a very early model of some Park Service historians and historical architects, their idea of what a memorial might look like on the arch grounds. Was never built, but what they wanted to do was preserve the original streetscape and then have a tall kind of obelisk Washington Monument type memorial right in the center. This area was even visited by President Roosevelt, who you see here in the back of a car with Mayor Dickman in 1936. By 1942, this is what the area looked like. You can see that almost all the buildings have been taken down, except for the cathedral. A large warehouse, which was near the south ends of the grounds, where they stored a lot of the architectural fragments from different buildings, and the old rock house. And the area would remain pretty much like this for about 20 more years. World War II came along. The money was not there any longer. The employees were not there any longer to do anything with the park. All the nation's efforts were focused on winning the Second World War. And so it wasn't until after the war that the project started to gear up again. In 1947, Luther Ely Smith, whose picture again you see, helped to gather the money and personally underwrite architectural competition that was the largest that had been held up to that point in time. The prize money for all the winners, finalists and semifinalists, amounted to $250,000. It was a lot of money in 1947. It was the biggest architectural competition that had ever been held in the United States, and certainly the biggest thing that had come along since World War II. So a lot of people entered this competition. Here you see the centerfold from the booklet that was issued to any entrant, and it shows the bare area of the riverfront that could actually be filled in by somebody sketching in this centerfold area. A distinguished panel of judges was gathered, who you see in this photograph, 7 distinctive American architects plus an architectural advisor, and these were the men who actually made the decision on which of the, as it ended up, 172 entries would become the memorial on the riverfront. And during the next few seconds, you will see a brief little slideshow of some of the ideas that were sent in. These could have been the memorial on the riverfront. St. Louis might have been known by these icons rather than by the Gateway Arch. These drawings were actually done by Walter Gropius, whose name you might have heard, a very famous architect. There were many, many others, including Gaio Abada, who's part of Abada and Casaubon architectural firm today. Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, Charles Eames, a lot of very big names submitted entries to this competition. But the winners of the competition were a design team, if I can go back here for just a second, that was headed by Eero Saarinen, who you see in this picture, who was second from the left. His wife Lily, Dan Kiley, Sandro Gerard, and Jay Henderson Barr. And here they're actually receiving their $40,000 check for being the winning entry. Saarinen was a virtual unknown. In fact, his father was a lot better known than he was. And in fact, when the first round of the competition took place, they sent a telegram to Eero Saarinen's father saying, "Congratulations, you're one of the semifinalists," until they looked really closely at the boards and they saw that it wasn't Ilil Saarinen, the father, at all. It was Eero. He was 38 years old at the time he won the architectural competition, and this is actually one of the renderings that they did at that time. I'm sorry it's kind of faded because of the amount of light in the room, but the point of showing it is that it's so close to what they actually built 20 years later. We're still talking about 1948 that this picture was made, so it was almost 20 years before the arch was actually built after it was designed. Part of the early designs involved a kind of an arcade that you see in this picture, concrete roofed, which would have sculptures about westward expansion, little stores. You'd walk along the riverfront and be covered by this concrete roof. And later that idea was abandoned. Things were changed. Dan Kiley, who was one of the most respected landscape architects, not only in the United States but in the world, was often a partner of Eero Saarinen in many of his projects, and the National Park Service project on the riverfront was one of them. And these are some of the sketches from his office of what the landscape would be like. Basically, the men envisioned a forest of trees with this triumphal arch rising high above them, and that's pretty much what was later built. This is a picture of Saarinen with some of the many models and sketches of the arch. They spent a long time trying to figure out exactly what type of curve the arch would have, how tall it would be, how much it would taper, just the general dimensions of it. The project went into hibernation for many years because of the Korean War, the budget deficit with the U.S. government, and during that time, Saarinen kept creating. He became one of the best-known architects in America and in the world, known for his furniture designs, which you see a couple of the chairs here, which have been adapted and very much used, very commonly. This is a picture of Saarinen in his studio. Made the cover of Time magazine in 1956. And some of his other designs include the chapel at MIT. This is the exterior and the interior. And the CBS headquarters building in New York City. The TWA terminal in New York. This is a picture of his most famous design, probably, other than the arch, the Dulles Airport terminal outside Washington, D.C. He was a master of materials and the use of materials. He studied airports to do Dulles and came up with this idea of these mobile lounges so people didn't have to walk so far to the planes. The lounge, you'd sit in it and they would take you to your airplane. At any rate, in 1956, the national government had a balanced budget, which was a huge thing. And it had been said by President Eisenhower that the St. Louis project would be revitalized when there was a balanced budget. So the project began, and in 1959, they broke earth. What they had to do first was get rid of this unsightly railroad trestle, which was along the riverfront. The government didn't want it there. The Terminal Railroad Association did. There was a huge fight for many years. The railroads were very powerful still at that time. This is a picture of Mayor Raymond Tucker of St. Louis. He had been the head of the engineering department at Washington University. He was a trained engineer. He's the one that broke the deadlock. He came up with the plan that was actually utilized there on the riverfront, which is a series of tunnels and open railroad cuts that run directly in front of the arch. And if you look closely today, it's landscaped really nicely into the grounds there, so you don't notice it. But the trains still run on tracks that go directly in front of the arch there. That broke the deadlock. It also got Saarinen to thinking about redesigning his project. And so that's how we ended up with an underground museum and visitor center. He decided since the arch had to be raised on a false hill to landscape in this railroad tunnel, that he would take advantage of that and put all the buildings that had been designed to be surface buildings underground. And so no surface buildings other than the arch itself are on the grounds today because of that. They also redesigned the landscape pretty heavily from what the 1948 plan had been. And these are some photographs taken between 1959 and 1961 as the railroad tunnels and cuts were built and the gigantic flood walls that some of you may have seen that are along the Mississippi River and of course saved us and the city in 1993 when we had the Great Flood. There was a new visitor center that was planned. You can see the early drawings for it here that was underground. Here a cutaway view showing the museum, visitor center, and inside of the tram system. And how many of you have ridden to the top of the arch before? Yeah, just about everybody. Were you real comfortable in those little cars that take you up to the top? Yeah, like getting into a dryer at the laundromat. Well, this is the guy you can blame for it. His name is Dick Bowser, and he was an independent contractor. He'd worked in elevators all his life. None of the big elevator corporations, Montgomery, Otis, any of them, wanted to take on this unique project of trying to make some sort of an elevator that could go around this big curve and take people to the top of the arch. Saarinen had always wanted people to be able to go to the top and to take advantage of an observation deck up there. So Dick was brought into the project. He was given a huge amount of time to try to come up with a concept, all of 2 weeks. And he did it. He met his deadline. And the basic plan that he came up with in 2 weeks' time, working out of his own basement, is what we still use today down at the arch, with very, very little changes. These are some of his original sketches. In fact, Saarinen also contributed some of the drawing on these. Dick gave us all of his personal papers a few years ago. Unfortunately passed away last year, but he was a great guy. And this is actually one of those tram cars at the point when it was coming right off the assembly line. They were built at the St. Louis Car Company, which used to make the trolley cars in St. Louis. So they were built right here in town. The happy man in the center is George Hartzog, who was our superintendent back in 1959 when they received the first money to start work on the arch. And unfortunately, Eero Saarinen would not live to see his arch built. He died in 1961. He was only 51 years old, died suddenly of a brain tumor. So he never got a chance to see the arch construction. As construction began, signs went up to advertise. There was an observation deck on the grounds, and they had to dig some really big holes because they wanted to go down to bedrock to make sure that this arch was going to be stable. And so at one point they had to dig down as far as 55 feet to get down to bedrock. Then they had to fill these holes with concrete, and there were 7 massive pours. The first pour took 23 hours steady to complete. They had to work a long, long time to build these gigantic concrete pads that the arch sits on. And here you see some of the reinforcing bars that are in those pads. There are reinforcements, and then as we'll talk about in a minute, there are what they call post-tensioning bars, and we'll talk about why that's important in just a minute. This is for the engineer and all of you. But you can get a good idea of how massive these pours are by the exposed area of this pad. It gives you an idea of how deep those foundations go. And here's a side view showing the opening. This is all made of concrete. And this is the visitor center being dug and built, which is underground in between the 2 legs of the arch. And here's some of the steel reinforcing rods. Basically, they also use post-tensioning rods in the structure. And what those were is they basically worked like the tendons in your arm or your leg. The big problem of building this arch was, as those of you who've studied engineering know, that no matter what material you build an arch out of, stone, concrete, steel, like the arch in St. Louis, whatever it is, it's a structure that comes in upon itself, that its weight is borne by the pressure against the midpoint where they have what they call the keystone. And so this arch would be no exception. The problem was, how do you build an arch 63 feet tall and not have the keystone section in there for it to push against? where is the tension going to come from to keep the legs apart so they don't fall in on each other. A lot of ideas were thrown around about how this might be done, but in the end, the idea that they accepted was the use of post-tensioning rods. And basically, they were steel rods that went up through the concrete on the back side of each of the legs, and they were tensioned with torque, which would give them extra power because they were compressed. It was pressure that was in there. So they were actually holding the legs back until they got up to a certain height when they actually put a stabilizing strut in place. So this complicated process was something that went on as the arch rose, and as each new section was put in and the gap in between the inner and outer walls was filled with concrete, they extended the post-tensioning bars and then tensioned them so that they continued to hold the legs back. The pieces for the arch were made in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area, and they were shipped to St. Louis on rail cars. And this is where the system of tunnels and cuts came into handy, because they could pull the railroad car right in next to the arch, and a crane would be able to lift the pieces off of the railroad cars from Pennsylvania, put it into the welding shack that you see a picture of here, where the individual pieces could be assembled, and then the cranes could move them over where they could be positioned and set onto the concrete pad, as they did with the first piece you see here, which was put in position on February 12, 1963. After they got up past 72 feet in height, the conventional cranes couldn't reach any higher, and so they devised this really interesting system of using a creeper derrick that was attached to tracks which were bolted into the backside of the leg of the arch. You can see one of them here. They didn't want any extra weight on that derrick, so the derrick operator actually sat in a shack on the ground, and he only responded to commands of somebody who was up on top of the leg to know what to do. Now, this is a picture of Bill Quigley, who was the derrick operator on the north leg for the entire project. He actually set the last piece of the arch in place in 1965. And this is a picture of the shack down on the ground where he would sit with all the controls. And as the arch would grow, as they added piece after piece, they'd also extend the tracks higher on the back side of the arch. So the derrick could be moved up, kind of like an elevator, and stay near the top of construction. Some pictures of some of the pieces being lifted into place. This picture is a photograph of the only time they did a double lift. On the same day, both the north and south legs had a piece added to them, and they acted independently. The creeper derricks had an operator for the north derrick, operator for the south derrick. The derricks not only lifted pieces into place, but these huge buckets full of cement that went in between the inner and outer layers. The arch is built with what they call orthotropic design, which basically means that it doesn't have a skeleton of girders that holds it in place. It's kind of a what you see is what you get affair. The stainless steel on the outside and the carbon steel on the inside are the actual structural members. So there's no string of girders or steel or iron or anything like that inside of it that holds it together. It's all held together by the elements that you can actually see on the outside and on the very inside when you ride the tram up on the inside of the leg. While the work was going on the outside, there were men on the inside who were building things like the stairway, the emergency stairs that go all the way to the top. There's 1,076 steps in those stairs. The elevator shafts, the tram tracks, all of those things, the electricity, the heating and air conditioning system, were all being put in at the same time that the outside was being built. And these are some of the men on the inside. As the arch got up to 530 feet, it was getting to the point where, with that creeper derrick on the back, it was very unstable. They were swaying around up there in the wind, and very uncomfortable for the workers on really windy days. What they decided to do, and this was a plan that they'd had from the very beginning, was to put in a stabilizing strut, which would help to alleviate some of the stresses from nature, especially the wind. And this strut was almost the length of a football field, 40 feet wide. One of the most difficult lifts because both the north and south derrick operators had to lift this thing up simultaneously so that it could be hooked in to each leg. And here you see it in place. One of the funnier stories that one of the workmen told me was about the net that they had suspended beneath the stabilizing strut. That net was supposed to catch anybody that might fall. One of these guys up on the top decided that it might be fun just to jump into the net. And the creeper derrick operator would have to pull him out. So the guy I talked to urged caution, said, maybe we should try it out first before you just make a jump. So what they decided to do was to make a dummy. They took a bunch of construction work clothes and they put weights inside them, wrenches and all kinds of things to make it about the same weight as the guy who wanted to jump. And then they threw it off the way a man would jump. Well, it landed in the Mississippi River. So they decided that it might not be such a good idea to test out the net. You get an idea of what it must have been like to be up there from this man welding. Look at the buildings in the background. I mean, you know, you're out there on top of a 63-story building, and they did not use any kind of tethers, any kind of safety devices. They just walked around up there. If OSHA had been in charge back then, we never would have built the arch. The man on the left-hand side of this picture who's kind of leaning on the fence is Vito Comparato. He was the caller for the north leg and worked with Bill Quigley. He was the one who actually called out the signals to move the pieces into place for welding, and he was the one who called the signals for the final piece to go in place in 1965. October 28th, 1965, they were ready for that final piece to go up. They had to jack the two sides of the legs apart, the two legs apart, to make a gap wide enough to put this piece in. And you may have heard that the fire department was even called out to spray water on the south leg because the heat of the day, the sun, was actually skewing the legs, so they were going out of alignment. And so they had to try to cool that south leg down so that it wasn't too far out of alignment to put this final piece in and weld it into place. This is a scene actually taken on the inside of the arch as that final piece was being slid into place and finally welded in, which completed the arch. And of course, our famous film at the arch, A Monument to the Dream, really ends with that, with the completion. But of course, the arch wasn't done. They still had to take those creeper derricks off the legs, and those came down gradually. It took about a year to take the tracks off, to work at polishing the stainless steel, giving it that final cleaning, because for sure nobody was going to be up there for a very long time. Getting it all perfect. They had little plugs that they'd saved from where the bolts went in for the creeper derrick tracks that they welded into place and covered over, and today when you go down to the arch, if you really look carefully at the back of the leg, you still can't see them. But there were at one time tracks bolted to the back of the arch. And they finished off the interior. They built the observation deck and the cosmetic fronts for the area where the tram cars are. Down below, the empty visitor center was turned into the visitor center that you see today. By 1967, the trams had gotten all the kinks worked out of them, and they opened to the public. And people started to take rides up to the top of the arch. The arch wasn't dedicated until 1968, after people had gone up to the top quite frequently. We'd been open for about a year. Vice President Hubert Humphrey came and gave the keynote address as the arch was dedicated in a huge rainstorm, which the drains failed at either end of the arch, and having an underground visitor center wasn't a very good idea when the water started pouring in like a waterfall. You can see this little kid's having a ball, like jumping through the puddles here. The world's shallowest water ballet during our... And the two projects after the dedication that needed to be finished were the landscaping of the grounds to fulfill Saarinen's dream, and the museum of westward expansion to tell people what the real story of the arch is. The landscaping took a period of about 10 years to complete, to build the ponds and plant the trees that you see on the grounds, but pretty much fulfilled Dan Kiley's vision. This is the area where our museum is today. This is what a man named Aram Martirosyan had to work with in order to create a design for our museum. And in this photo, you see a model that he built. He's holding up part of it in this picture of what the museum would be like. This picture was actually taken on the opening day of our museum in 1976, when visitors first came in to see the various exhibits that tell them about that sweep of history during the 19th century when the United States expanded westward. Later in time, we were given a collection of American Indian peace medals, which some of you who visited the Arch in the last 10 years or so have probably seen. And we have the largest exhibit of peace medals that is on display anywhere in the world, covenants between the Indian nations and the United States. And the Arch is kind of a lovable memorial. I mean, it's one that people can come and stand up next to and actually touch it. More accessible maybe than some other memorials. Just recently we completed the grand staircase, which was part of Saarinen's dream, so it extends all the way across the riverfront and leads up to the Arch. And I think if Luther Ely Smith, who never saw the Arch built, he died in 1951, or Eero Saarinen, who designed the Arch and never saw it completed, could come back today, I think they'd be pretty proud of what they were able to create on the St. Louis riverfront. A memorial that is extraordinary. It draws people from all over the world who are interested in architecture, interested in history, interested in memorialization, or just interested in a good time. They just want to ride to the top of that arch. But for whatever reason they come, it's a memorial that sums up the history of our community and tells people about what we're all about as Midwesterners and as St. Louisans. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'll be glad to stay for a couple minutes and answer any questions you might have. That's a really good question. Did anybody die while the arch was being built? The insurance companies estimated that 13 men would die. I guess it's a good number, you know, real creepy and mysterious. But, you know, they estimated it's such a weird project that 13 men would die. But no one died while the arch was being built. And I think it's a tribute to the main contractor that was McDonald Construction Company of St. Louis, and the subcontractor, which was Pittsburgh Des Moines Steel, and their safety procedures and operations. Both companies, but especially McDonald, had worked a lot for the government, so they were very aware of government safety regulations. They built a lot of missile silos and things like that across the country before they did the Arch project. So yeah, it was extraordinary. There were no major injuries when the Arch was being built. I mean, the worst things I can think of, one guy told me about his toe got cut off, and they actually saved it and sewed it back on at the hospital. So he still has it today. One guy got a metal filing in his eye, and he did go blind in that eye. I think that's the worst permanent injury I've heard of anybody that worked on the Arch. So, you know, extraordinary safety record for such an extraordinary job. Just to give you a quick, for instance, I don't want to cut off questions, but you might be interested in this. The people who worked on the inside told me that it was so weird in there because it is curved. And so when you're inside, you have no relation, nothing to like shoot off of with your eyes to say, that's the horizon, that's level. Inside the arch, everything was kind of like the crooked man's house. You know, you didn't know which end was up. So it was very easy to lose your balance because you couldn't sight off of anything to figure out where the horizon was and where to, you know, get your equilibrium, keep your balance. So, you know, the potential for danger and for injury was very great, not just on the outside, but on the inside of the arch while it was being built. Wanted to know about daredevil stunts and security concerns. Daredevil stunts, at the beginning, despite an FCC regulation that was, or not FCC, FAA regulation that was passed before the arch was even finished about aircraft flights, there were a lot of people who tried to fly through the arch and actually did. I think we Altogether, and this stopped before 1980, we haven't had any since then, but there were 13 flights through the arch. And anybody whose tail number was obtained doing that, they lost their pilot's license. So there were a few that got caught. But nobody's really tried that in recent years. The other thing would be people who want to either climb the arch or jump off of it. And we've stopped a few people from climbing it. There was one man in 1980 who parachuted out of an airplane, landed on top of the arch, and we don't know exactly what his plan was, but we think that it was that he would use his secondary chute to then jump from the top of the arch to reach the ground. Unfortunately, his second chute didn't open quickly enough, and he died during his attempt to jump from the top of the arch down to the ground. The other one, there was a man named John Vincent, who was kind of known as, I guess his job was being a daredevil or something. He was a base jumper who climbed the arch, he said, in the middle of the night with suction cups, and in the morning he jumped off and successfully jumped off, and then ran up the street to Channel 5 so they could do a live interview with him, and so we could come up and arrest him. Like I say, he said he climbed the arch with suction cups, but we're kind of skeptical about that. We think maybe a helicopter dropped him off there in the middle of the night. The reason we're skeptical is because, believe it or not, with all the winds at the top of the arch, on top of the arch there is dirt, dust that has accumulated. And we could see, after he was up there, we went out the top hatch, and we could see that there were footprints up there, but they were only around the aircraft warning light. There were no prints coming from the north leg or the south leg or crawl marks or anything to get him to the center part. So we were a little skeptical of his claims about climbing the arch with suction cups during the night. And then you asked about security concerns. Yes, we have great security concerns. We are designated as one of, I believe it is 7 now, icon parks in the United States. So within the government, within the national park system, there are 7 park areas, including the Statue of Liberty, the Washington Monument, Mount Rushmore, areas that are highly visible, large, and demonstrative of our nation's heritage and very special places to Americans that have this special category that we feel that they might be at risk and that we need to employ stricter security measures than we might at other park areas across the country. So we've put in place some stricter, search procedures and things like that than we had prior to 9/11. But business goes on as usual, and we get very few complaints. People have to go through a screening system similar to what you have at the airports. But most people, when they do say anything about it, usually say, "We're really glad that you're doing this. We feel that you're protecting our nation's heritage by doing it and protecting everybody who's in here with us right now." So we've gotten a favorable reaction to having tighter security. So thanks very much for your attention.